Welcome to this podcast, The Good Congress. I am your host, Brad Fitch, and I'll be walking you through a series of interviews with leading experts in Congress and democracy. The goal here is to help identify what are the principles and path to a good Congress, explore strategies and proposals to improve congressional operations and outcomes, and hopefully build greater trust in American democratic institutions. Let's get started with today's topic and guest. Today, I'm delighted to have on the program former Congresswoman Cheri Bustos. Congresswoman Bustos, welcome to the Good Congress.
Brad, and I love the name of your program. We should always strive to be a good Congress. So I love it. Thanks for having me.
I want to just give a little background on our guest here today because it's quite interesting. Cheri Bustos was in Congress for 10 years, representing the state of Illinois. She retired recently in 2023. She was in leadership, chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, or DCCC, co-chair of the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee. She won an award from my former organization, the Congressional Management Foundation, a Democracy Award for Constituent Engagement, which made her one of the best offices on Capitol Hill. And I love this in her background. In the Illinois College Sports Hall of Fame, as the 1981 Outstanding Female Athlete of the Year. Congresswoman Bustos, what were your sports?
I played basketball and volleyball, and this was, not too long after Title IX. So, when I started playing sports, it was when the coaches for the girls in high school were the gym teachers, were the PE teachers. And our basketball coach she loved yoga, and she was under 5 feet tall.
Huh.
And she was our basketball coach in our early years. And my sister was almost 6 feet tall and is a terrific athlete. And my dad would be in the stands telling my sister to move and get open. And this coach who loved yoga would just say, "Lynn, just stand there." Thinking that she should just stand there and wait for the ball to come to her. So, but I went on, I played basketball and volleyball, and Division III school. So I should say that's why I was able to play both sports. But, and the reason I brought up, at the advent of Title IX is now you've got Caitlin Clark and you've got kind of this popularity of women's basketball. Back then, we were lucky if we would have, like a tenth of the stands full, but I loved it. I love that I was able to play in college, and I actually played sports all through my time in Congress. I played on the women's congressional softball team and on the annual basketball game as well.
Well, I'm going to digress here because there's something that people don't know, and we talk about, a good Congress, and one of the things that leads to a good Congress is the development of bipartisan relationships. And I know one of the things that differentiates the men's baseball team with the women's softball team is the men's baseball teams are Democrats and Republicans playing against each other. For the women in Congress, you had a different adversary and you played in a bipartisan way. Could you describe a little bit about the women's softball team and how it helped build a better Congress?
Yeah, so it's actually, Brad, I'm glad you brought that up because it's one of my favorite stories to tell especially when I'm talking to younger people and especially when I'm talking to women, because one of the points I make is that in Washington, D.C., as you pointed out in the men's baseball game, the once a year charity baseball game that's played under the lights at Nationals, the Major League Ballpark, it's been for 100 plus years, Republicans against Democrats. So my point there is like, even in Washington, D.C., on the sports field, we can't seem to get it right on bipartisanship. But the women, we play, our charity is to help young women with breast cancer. Debbie Wasserman Schultz started the women's softball team and the game every year. And we do play Democrats and Republicans, House members and senators together. And our opponent is the Women's Washington Press Corps, which I think is totally appropriate. But it really is a way that when you're wearing your sweats and no makeup and barely, maybe you combed your hair, maybe you didn't, at 7 o'clock in the morning, and you're on the field, you get to know people in a different light. You end up getting to know their whoever their partners are, their kids, and it was always a highlight for me. I built some really close relationships that way.
Yeah, it's also a very festive environment. I love going to that game because, as you pointed out, it's not a Nationals park. It's on a little baseball field. in Northeast Washington, about 11 blocks from the Capitol. And the stands are lower. The last game I was at, I was sitting next to Secretary of Interior Debbie Haaland and Congresswoman Schakowsky. I mean, the interactions and the relationship building that happens even in the stands is different than at the men's game. It just has a completely different vibe, and I always enjoyed attending that one.
Yeah, it's an elementary school lot, by the way.
Yeah,
And then you have Andrea Mitchell doing play by play.
yeah.
To your point, Speaker Pelosi would always come by. When Paul Ryan was the speaker, he would come by. Kevin McCarthy came by. So it really is a nice vibe, but totally different from how the men structure their game, where they play versus where we play in our opponent. And I prefer the way the women do it.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, let's jump into today's topic. We want to talk about constituent engagement. I think identified you because, in part, you won a Democracy Award for constituent engagement and constituent service. I'm going to start in an unusual way reading a quote from a political scientist. I rarely quote political scientists because, frankly, they usually don't get it right. But Richard Fenno was an author I read when I was in college, wrote a book called Homestyle, and Homestyle was a unique piece of political science work. He traveled over a few years with 18 different members of Congress, House members back in their districts. Nothing ever has been done like that since. And it's a seminal piece of writing. And even though it's 5 decades old, it still rings true when you read it again in terms of what motivates members of Congress and how they interact with constituents. And he talked about constituent engagement this way, and I'll quote from the book. The more accessible they are, House members believe, the more will their constituents be encouraged to feel that they can communicate with the member of Congress when and if they wish. However, this kind of assurance is not obtained by one-shot offers. It is created over a long time and underwritten by trust. Access and the assurance of access, communication and the assurance of communication. These are the irreducible underpinnings of representation. Congresswoman, I'd like to hear your general views on the framing that Fenno uses for constituent engagement and what he called the irreducible underpinnings of representation. What are some of your general philosophical thoughts on just generally constituent engagement and its value to our democracy?
I think that is exactly right. And he saw that because he went to these members' districts. And I don't know what districts he went to or what members he shadowed, but that's the way the job should be done. One of my favorite phrases, and I don't know if it was original to Steny Hoyer, our longtime number two in the House out of the state of Maryland, but he would always say that representative is not just a job title; it's a job description.
Oh, wow.
And I love that. I attribute that to him because that's who I would hear it say over and over. But and it's so true. Like our bosses, it's not the Speaker of the House, it's not the President of the United States, it's not the chair of any committee. Our bosses are the people back home, and so the award that you mentioned that our office was fortunate enough to get, I think was a result of how we approached our job. And that was if we weren't in Washington, D.C. voting on legislation, we were home. I never stayed in Washington for a weekend unless we had votes over the weekend. And we did three things that I think were differentiators, and it plays into the quote that you just read, that I think really helped make sure that we were in touch with the people back home. Number one, every Saturday, we did something called Supermarket Saturday, where I would walk the aisles of, it might be a 6-aisle grocery store, it might be a supermarket. We had 150 towns and 14 counties and 7,000 square miles in the district that I represented. So lots of little mom and pop grocery stores and, the Hy-Vees or the Krogers. And we would just walk. I would always have one person, typically my district director, and she always had her business cards in case we ran across somebody who wanted some help. But if somebody made eye contact with me, I would just say, "Hi, I'm Cheri Bustos. I, serve this area in Congress, and I'll be flying out to Washington on Monday. What do you want me to know?" So always an open-ended question. Never tried to steer in any direction. And so you really did get a feel. I could go into almost any election cycle and really not have to poll to see what people were thinking or feeling
Wow.
because we did that every Saturday.
You know,
Number
keep
Oh,
going.
go ahead,
Keep
Brad.
going. No, keep going.
Well, yeah, very quickly. Number two, we had a lot of small town libraries because it was a very rural congressional district. And so we would get these surplus books out of the Library of Congress, and we were allowed to give those to any nonprofit that we wanted to. So we would take 50 books at a time and go to the small town libraries and donate those. And then it was an opportunity to have mini town halls. We would always invite the public and what you notice, Brad, about having town halls in a library is you think about how you were raised and going to libraries as a kid. You were taught to, not yell, be polite, all of that. So it really took away kind of the show offiness of getting, at a microphone and yelling and that sort of thing. So that was the second thing we did that I think was really helpful. And then third, we did something we called it Cheri on Shift, where I job shadowed people all over our congressional district. Did 130 of these over time, and it was typically, jobs that are really really hard jobs that of people who might get overlooked, people who process carp out of the Illinois River, people who pour steel into molds to make different products. A delivery man, a grocery store sacker, someone who changes the street bulbs from a cherry picker 30 feet in the air. Just all these different things. And I learned a lot from people who work really, really hard and what they do to support their families and what their dreams are and their concerns are. And that probably was the most helpful of those three things. But that is, I think, how we played out in real life. That quote that you just talked about of getting to know people and getting to know their concerns and representing them.
I want to tease out some of those answers you gave, but I want to share an anecdote that I think you'll appreciate. For a book I wrote a few years ago called The Citizen's Handbook, I interviewed members of Congress. And I was struck, one of the people I interviewed, I can reveal now because she's not in Congress anymore, was Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. And she also talked about connecting with constituents in grocery stores. And one of the things she said to me that I found amusing was she would do it while she was doing her regular shopping. So she would plan her shopping experience knowing that she was going to spend, well, she didn't know it at first because she told me she said that she made a mistake the first time she did this and went to the frozen food aisle first, and then everything was unfrozen by the time she got done because
I get
it
it.
melted. Yeah, she stood there
Love
for an
it.
hour and a half. But I do want to talk on this experience you've described as interacting with constituents in their environment. One of the interviews I did was with a member of Congress who talked about how in one setting he was coaching his son's little league team and he was coaching first base and a mom came up to him while he was coaching first base and lectured him on Middle East peace policy. And what I loved about that is he can't go anywhere. He's still got to be there for 3 outs. So it's an ideal setting for the constituent.
Right.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit. I mean, some people think, I mean, certainly you don't want to be interrupted in a meal with your kids, or something like that. That's probably not cool for a constituent. But talk a little bit about just the casual constituent engagement and why it's really kind of okay to come up to your member of Congress in a grocery store.
Well, back to what we were just talking about. When you're elected to represent, in the case of the district I serve, 711,000 people. First of all, it doesn't matter if they voted for you or didn't; you still represent them. And number two, this is not a 9 to 5 job. It is not a Monday through Friday job. And you've got to. People are busy with their lives. They're busy with their work. And if they happen to run into you and have something to share with you, uh, you got to be there for them. And so, no, it's, I hope that in the 10 years that the 5 terms that I served in Congress, I don't think I was ever rude to anybody or told anybody to go away or anything like that. Now, there were some times that I had time constraints. And that was when I'd ask if I was doing our supermarket Saturday, where my district director would hand her card and say, you know what, we'll follow up with you on Monday, type of thing. But no, I think that's part of the job. And people who think that being a member of Congress is that members don't work hard. There are some who don't. That would be true, but there are many who work very, very hard in making sure that they get to know the people in their districts and the concerns, and then have their votes reflect what is needed in their congressional districts.
Most people don't realize how many hours most members of Congress invest. The Congressional Management Foundation did a study some years ago and found out that the average work week for a member when they're in their district is 60 hours a week, and their average work week when they're in Washington is 70 hours a week. Now, I know a lot of people don't think much of the work product of the United States Congress, but certainly the work ethic you can't contest with. It's
Yeah,
quite the investment.
yeah.
And I know that working with so many members and looking at their schedules, it's especially freshman members that you know stop eating and stop sleeping and stop exercising. It's really hard to get into a routine. I'm glad you succeeded at it. I got to come back to the job swapping because I've always admired elected officials when they did this. Bob Graham, the senator from Florida, was famous at doing this both as a governor and senator. You've done it. But I'm just really curious. Two questions. What was the best job you got to do? And what was the most dangerous?
A lot of them are dangerous. I mean, that's the thing where, if you're a college educated office person, that we really need to have that understanding of what makes our world go around. And it is so many of these jobs that if you think about doing them day in and day out, 40 plus hours a week, just how hard that would be. I'll tell you, actually, the one that I mentioned to you about changing a street bulb, from a cherry picker, I loved that. I know and I don't even like heights,
Yeah.
but probably part of it was a beautiful sunny day. I was with this IBEW worker, the Illinois Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. So he was a union worker. He could not have been nicer. Their emphasis on safety. I had this harness on, and he was not going to let anything happen. And it would probably was just the people that I was around for that specific job. It was fun. It was interesting. The people were great. And the other thing, Brad, I think worth noting about, whether it's that job or the carp processor, um, there's a lot of pride in the work that they do. And I have a great appreciation for that as well. That's what I noticed about most of these jobs is whatever they are, the people who were doing those jobs, they took pride in it. And I would say one of probably um, the one the carp processing, and I guess the reason I bring those couple up is because they're so memorable. But um, this guy was a fisherman on the Illinois River, and he would go out no matter what the weather, and he had been doing it since he was 16 years old,
Wow.
and he was at this point in his late 40s. So think about that. And he would catch carp, and then he would bring him back to this processing plant. And at this processing plant, he would every single one of those carp had to be taken out of his boat and go into these different bins. Sometimes he would catch a catfish rather than a carp. So the catfish went in one bin, the carp would go in another. And then what happens after that? This was a different set of workers. They would chop off the head. Again, this is a job, chopping off the fish heads, chopping off the tail. Then you got like this fillet knife where they're filleting the fish, and then they debone them, and the bones go in one little area, and the meat, the fish meat goes in another. Then that goes through this whole processing thing, and then they package them. I mean, it is like, again, think about the jobs that you've had and that I've had. I'm sitting in an office right now. You're sitting in your desk right now. It's climate controlled. Our hands aren't getting dirty. At the end of the day, we don't have fish guts all over us. But that's what
Wow.
this guy has done since he was 16 years old. And so those are the kind of people, how we on in Congress, you have your little voting card. where you would vote on the House floor for the different pieces of legislation. And I always thought, like, every time I put in that voting card to vote yes or to vote no on something, I always just wanted to make sure that I would picture the people,
Hmm.
um, like the fishermen, or like the IBEW worker, or the mailman, or the UPS driver, or the grocery store stacker, and just realize that every vote impacted people. And was it going to be something that would be hurtful, or would it be helpful? And you just always did your best to get that right.
I want to shift the conversation to talk about those times that we have in our congressional history when people are frankly riled up, where there is a pressure campaign. I like to describe the two types of categories of grassroots efforts as facilitated grassroots and organic grassroots. And facilitated is the vast majority, and that's where a trade association or nonprofit will ask their members or supporters to contact a member of Congress. One of the mistaken beliefs is this is called astroturf, and I hate that term because no, these are real constituents who want to increase funding for Alzheimer's research or want to protect horses or whatever issue you got. But there are also times when it's organic. And I think the first time I experienced that as a congressional staffer was in the early 1990s when Congress decided it needed to get rid of honoraria, which were monies that were paid to members of Congress for speeches by special interest groups. Terribly unethical practice. And it was replaced by a pay raise. And members were on the receiving end of very angry phone calls. 2006, we had an immigration bill that had bipartisan support, presidential support, and Rush Limbaugh labeled it as amnesty. In 2010, we had the Affordable Care Act passed, and that was, an explosion of communications coming in. In 2017, we had Trump's first year in office, and I remember reading an article about a member of Congress having a town hall meeting that was overwhelmed with constituents. One guy came with a homemade sign, and the sign said, "I didn't come here to listen to you. I came here to yell." Um, I want you to look at both sides of the communication equation during these times because we're in one of those right now again with Trump's second term. Um, Looking at both members of Congress and also constituents in order to have some kind of healthy dialogue happen here with constituent engagement being somehow being constructive. What advice do you have for both members of Congress and constituents during this very volatile time, 2025 in American politics? What advice do you have for both sides of that communication equation?
Well, I happen to be a big advocate of civility. So, and this doesn't seem to be really that time in American history where that's valued. But the story that we talked about earlier, the reason I did our town halls at libraries is because I did want them to be civil. I didn't want to have to go to a great big auditorium with a loudspeaker and microphones and people just getting up and yelling. And there seems to be not always, but in some cases where there was a performative nature of those kind of town halls where you would have a member of the public, whether they were in your district or they were brought in from somewhere else, that would just want to be disruptive and to get a reaction from the member of Congress. For the people who end up watching this or listening to this, the term what trackers are. Trackers are people from the opposing side who will have now it's just the phone because it has a camera on it, but back in the day it'd be a video camera, and they would purposefully try to get a very negative reaction from you, have it on video, so then it could be used for an attack ad when the election came around. And I've seen this happen at these town halls where that was the goal, is to get a very bad reaction from a member of Congress. That said, I do think it's the responsibility of the member of Congress to have these meetings so you can so citizens can express their views. I guess my advice is just be, kids are watching. I don't think I ever said a swear word publicly when I was in office. And I would just always think my husband and I have three boys. They're all grown now, but I just would always think about kids watching members of Congress or elected officials and think that, they ought to stand for being good human beings first and foremost. And yeah, so I don't know if that's any advice necessarily, but I wish we could get to a more civil place again.
Shifting gears again, I want to talk about one of the newer forms of constituent engagement, and that's telephone town hall meetings. The Congressional Manager Foundation has worked with the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability at Ohio State and done some really breakthrough research on the value of telephone town halls. They increase people's trust in government, and it leads to even greater turnout in voting, greater trust in the member of Congress, greater education on the issues. And what's fascinating from a transformative perspective is they're incredibly scalable. I got a data point from one of the telephone town hall meeting companies, and in 2021, more than 3 million Americans participated in a congressional telephone
Wow.
town hall meeting. And, while these small forums and, citizen cabinets are great, but you're involving people in the tensies and twensies and thirties, not in the 3,000 or 4,000, which is the average number of people at a congressional telephone town hall. What did you think about congressional telephone town halls when you did them? What are the pros and cons from your perspective?
They were great for the reason you just pointed out. You could get so much bigger participation and from the comfort of a citizen's home. You didn't have to hop in their car. They didn't have to drive, 30 miles down the road. They could do it from the comfort of their homes. They had a chance to ask questions. There was always a moderator who would take the questions so they could see if, oh, there are 10 questions that are very similar. So for Jim and Joe and Sally and Mary, here's your answer. Here's the question for the member of Congress, and here's the answer. I liked them. I thought they were efficient. I could be out in Washington, D.C. and do a teletown hall for the people back home. So it was a way to be efficient, and it was a way to make yourself more accessible. I think all of those are positive. I guess really probably the only negative is that you don't have that personal interaction.
Yeah.
It's like what happened during COVID, right, where we had to go all of a sudden from in-person meetings, and in-person rallies, and in-person town halls, et cetera, to everything had to be like we're doing right now. It had to be virtual, and I'm a severe extrovert. Like I love to be around people, and I that's how I get my energy. And so, in those early days of COVID, my record of number of Zooms in one day was 13. And
No.
I remember at the end of the day, I felt exhausted, more so than if I had been out and met with 13 different meetings with people in person, because it was like you don't soak in the energy of a room. But I would say that's probably the negative, is just you can't be together.
Um, so much of constituent communication revolves around the mail. And you know that more than anybody as a member of Congress. Congress now gets uh, 50 million email messages from constituents a year. And these are real messages, not spam. Again, talk about both sides of the constituent communications equation. What advice do you have for constituents writing emails and members of Congress answering these emails?
Well, I will say this: if you want to let your elected official know about an issue, I think it's an incredibly effective way to do it. Every single week I was in office, I would get a weekly report from my staff. Now, a member of Congress, legislatively, we are allowed to have 18 full-time employees. We're capped at that number. We can have interns on top of that, but you can only have 18 full-time employees. And so all 18 of the people on our staff would have to write a highlight of their week. And what did they want me to know? And on top of it, the people who managed our mail would have to write what the top five issues were and how much mail we got on that issue. So and it would then break it down by phone call, email, or letter. So we would know how they were coming in. And so every single week I knew what we were being contacted about. And then out of that mail, we would have kind of the what would summarize what those topics were. And then also I would know, let's say the issue was immigration, whether people were for immigration reform or were for having fewer restrictions on immigration, whatever it was. So I would know pro con, top issues, how we were contacted about it. And so now, not every member of Congress, by the way, is kind of an independent practitioner from the perspective of you can structure your office however you want. You can, however many offices you have at home. Do you have more people out in DC than you do in your home offices? Do you have, how big is your legislative staff? How big is your communication staff? All of that. You can structure it however you want. That was something that was very, very important to me, that I got that weekly report and I knew exactly what was going on out home or at home, what was going on legislatively, et cetera. So I guess my advice to anybody is I think it's an effective way to let your elected official know what's on your mind. If you want a meeting, if it's something that where you actually want to sit down with the staff or with the elected official, I think that it's in Congress you go through the scheduler, and that's probably the most effective way if you want to sit down meeting.
It's interesting in listening to you, Congresswoman, that there's not just an underlying thread, but an overt comment that you're making about you seem to find real value in constituent engagement. I think there's this belief among American public that, members of Congress or any politician are just, frankly, BSing their way through it. But what I'm hearing from you is, and I wrote this in a book once, that members of Congress are the best pollsters in the world because they're the only pollsters who, if they get the answer wrong, they lose their job. And
Uh,
and you really, I just have gotten this sense in this interview that this wasn't a one-way exchange in terms of collecting data, that you really found this valuable as a way to help you make positive and constructive policy decisions.
well, and Brad, you and I were talking before we started here. You and I both started our careers as journalists, as reporters. And I think it's probably a lot from that background that, where first of all, you've got to be able to, as a reporter, make people feel comfortable talking with you, right? Because most people don't interact with reporters day to day. How do you interview somebody and make them feel comfortable so they will talk with you? So making people feel comfortable and doing a lot more listening than talking. I think also politicians aren't exactly known for being good listeners, but I tried really, really hard to ask more questions and learn from others to help me be better at my job. And that was something that was really important to us in our office. But no, I loved my job. I like to say I loved 95% of it, but the 5% that I didn't like as much was really, really, really hard to the point where, I've never lost an election. I won two for city council and five for Congress and left on my own terms, which I'm really proud of. I wasn't in trouble. I didn't age out of the job. I wasn't, the voters didn't send me packing, but I did it on my own terms. And a lot of it was for my family. I was on the House floor on January 6th. And for my family, that was one step too far for them. And we had a family meeting at over Easter after January 6th. That was the first time we were all together. And we just made a family decision that I was young enough by Washington standards that I could have another career, and that let's just say what it was a great 5 terms. We made a difference. We helped people, and let's go on to the next thing.
Well, Congresswoman Bustos, congratulations on that career and for the public service and contribution to both the citizens of Illinois and your district, but to the country as well. And thank you for being our guest on The Good Congress.
I thank you, Brad.